Hi class, welcome to week 3. In this video I review chapter 1 by asking the question, what is analysis, and by reviewing the 5 analytical moves. I also end by doing a very short analysis of an advertisement, such as you will do in your homework or in your paper. So let's begin. What is analysis? As you've probably picked up through your reading, analysis is a frame of mind. It's a way of approaching the world with an active mind rather than a passive one that thinks about the world and asks questions rather than just accepting what you see. It's also detective work. It's a way of helping you make sense of things that you find puzzling. You do this by asking questions, particularly how and why. How is something put together, and why is something put together? Finally, analysis is a set of skills, formulas and steps that you can use to develop and inculcate that frame of mind. In fact, much of the rest of the semester will be devoted to developing those skills. When we ask what analysis is, we should also talk about what it's not. Analysis is not digging to find hidden meanings. Analysis is where your mind and the text meet. What this means is no single interpretation is right, which is a common student worry that when teachers ask for analysis or interpretations, we're fishing for some kind of hidden meaning. That's not at all how this thing works. However, this doesn't mean that all meaning is just interpretation or opinion. This is not a subjective exercise in how does this reading make me feel or how does this advertisement make me feel. Interpretation is still a rational thinking exercise, and what that means is your interpretations are going to stand or fall based on how firmly tied they are to evidence, to the details of the object that you are analyzing. So, what does this mean for writing? According to well, first of all writing is analytical to some degree, because writing is, this is a quote from the books, a sustained act of reflection and thinking. Writing is not just information downloading and formatting. Even when you're presenting information to your readers, you are telling them what you think is important and why you think it's important. This means that even when you're just presenting information, you have to analyze it to some degree. So let's move on to the 5 analytical moves, right? They are, step 1, suspend judgment. This is pretty important because how can you know how you feel about something until you know exactly what it is? And we've covered a lot of that in chapter 2 already. Particularly using the question or the statement, what I find most interesting about this is ... That statement should help you get past your judgment and maybe actually deal with the material. Step 2 is to define significant parts and how they're related, and then we'll deal more with that later in the semester. Step 3 is to look for patterns. And 3 things that you're particularly looking for in patterns are patterns of repetition. Obviously, if something is repeated, the writer thinks it is important. Next, we're looking for binary oppositions. And for most of you, this is a new term and one that causes a bit of confusion with students. The way to think about a binary opposition is 2 terms that are firmly linked to each other and are defined as opposite of one another. Some examples of binary oppositions are man versus woman, black versus white, good versus evil, east versus west, north versus south, Christian versus Muslim. These either-or situations are things that we use as human beings to make sense of and to order our world. Writers use binaries to make meaning as well, and it's something you should look for. It helps you figure out how something's put together, right? So I want to caution you, when you're looking for binaries in a writer's work, or even in an advertisement you're looking at, they're not necessarily going to be right out there on the surface. They're not going to say, you know, I think white is better than black, or I think that up is better than down, okay? Sometimes you'll only see one side of the binary at work. Sometimes the binary will be completely implicit. It means it's just hinted at rather than being there on the surface. What this means is you will have to do the interpretation to try and flesh out what the binary is. And we'll see an example of that when I look at Truman Capote's Out There. Okay. After looking for patterns, step 4 is make the implicit explicit. Oh, let me step back. Sorry. After binary oppositions, the third thing we're looking for are anomalies. Anomalies are anything that do not seem to fit. This means do not seem to fit everything else that you've looked at, and sometimes it'll be what does not seem to fit the lists of repetitions of binaries that you've already discovered. Oftentimes, we can use anomalies to help us restart our analysis, to discover an entirely new set of repetitions or binaries that we didn't see in the first place. So as you'll see, anomalies can be very helpful for moving on to step 5, which is to repeat. But getting back to the 5 analytical moves, step 4 is make the implicit explicit. And you'll notice that I have actually reversed steps 2 and 3 as they are in the textbook, because finding patterns can actually help you locate implicit meanings. So if you're looking at a text or an advertisement and you can't quite come to some kind of what might be implicit here, go right to looking for patterns. That might help you identify something that you didn't identify in the first place. And of course, after you've done all this, go ahead and repeat. So let's actually look at the analytical moves with an object. And I want to use the first paragraph of Capote's out there. I mean, I'm going to skip steps 1 and 2 and pretty much just go right to number 3, looking for patterns, looking for repetitions, are binaries, and are anomalies. So, as you may recall, this is the first paragraph that I had you read last week of Truman Capote. And what I've done here is gone through and highlighted some significant repetitions in the text. You notice that there's 2 major strands. I've labeled one as blue and the other one as red. Okay, so if you notice here, words like wheat plains, countryside, Middle West, prairie, and grain elevators, all in blue, all go together, whereas hard, desert, far west, barbed, ranch hand, narrow frontier trousers, Stetson, high-heeled boots, you know, the cowboy boots, horses and herds of cattle also go together. All right, so we have 2 significant lists of repetitions here. I want to point out that I have not put in my list or highlighted for you words like Kansas. Yes, Kansas is repeated, but this is not a significant repetition. Of course the writer has to repeat Kansas because that's what he's talking about. We're more interested in the words that give us some sense of Truman Capote's thinking, some sense of his own interpretation. What is it that he wants us to think about Kansas? And it's these words that I've highlighted that help us make sense of his interpretation of Kansas. So here again are my repetitions, right? The blue one's on one side, the red one's on the other. So the next step here, before moving on to binaries, is to stop and take a moment to think about what do these mean. Perhaps, you know, what is implicit in these repeated words. So let's make the implicit explicit. Those lists of the blue words I would associate with Midwest farmers. Of course, this is my interpretation. And the red words I would associate with Far West cowboys. So, taking a moment to think about what I think of when I think of Midwest farmers versus Far West cowboys, right? Midwest farmers are often associated with conventional religious values and morality and family values, whereas cowboys are associated with being tough, self-sufficient, rugged, quiet. Now notice that Truman Capote tells us that the people in Holcomb are more like cowboys than they are farmers. So they are a little of this and a lot more of that. They're not actually in tension with each other. They're not opposites because the people are both. But they're much more like the cowboys than they are like the farmers. So the next step is, if they're not in binary opposition with one another, what is? What I've put on this page is Far West because he tells us they are far more Far Western than they are Midwestern. So we have to ask ourselves, what is opposite of the Far West? I think most of us would recognize eastern cities, right? Because when we think about the values or the things we associate with the two, when we think of the Far West, we think of the cowboy. You know, for the eastern cities, it would be the businessman. When we think of the Far West, we think of it being quiet versus the eastern cities being very busy and loud. When we think of the Far West, we think of it being hard. You know, hard living conditions, hard men and women, versus Eastern cities where we think of people being softer, right? But then look at this last one. This is really interesting and important for what Truman Capote is doing. When we think about the two, in comparison, we think of the Far West as being safe as opposed to the Eastern cities where a lot of crime occurs. This is really interesting because we're reading a true crime novel. This opening paragraph is the first paragraph of a novel about a murder, the very kind of murder we would associate with Eastern cities, not with Far West ranch hand towns. This is highly ironic, and we see this kind of irony throughout the rest of the book being In Cold Blood. So, that takes care of our repetitions of binaries. What about our anomalies? Going back to the paragraph, if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll notice there's something that just doesn't fit everything we've said so far, and that would be this statement. Grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples. Greek temples? What do Greek temples have to do with Midwestern farmers or Far West cowboys? There's a lot that we could say here, but just to be brief, when I think Greek temples, I think high tragedy. I think of murders. I think of great men being brought low, like Oedipus or Antigone or Odysseus. This also relates to Truman Capote's mission throughout the entire book, which is to talk about men, particularly one man that he's interested in, how this one man gets corrupted into a crime. Now this completes my lesson on Chapter 1. Let's take a moment to look at an advertisement and think about the kind of analysis you need to do for the homework that is due this week. Here's an advertisement. This one happens to be PETA's human meat advertisement. It's meant to convince Americans to not eat meat by drawing a correlation between killing animals and murder. Now we can say a lot about this advertisement. Although it seems rather simple, there are a ton of details in here that have a lot of implicit meanings. I just want to draw your attention to one implicit meaning that this advertisement says through its details. And what I mean by implicit is one aspect of this advertisement that's not part of its overt don't eat meat message. So let's look at what I think are a couple of repeated details here. First of all, you'll notice that it is a woman, not just a woman, but an attractive woman, who happens to be naked. She also, if you look here and here, she's wearing jewelry, and she has makeup on. Her eyebrows are really neatly done. She has some lipstick on and looks like some eyeliner. In addition, with her hair being done and her being behind plastic, what this means to me, she looks like a centerfold in a magazine. So this is what I see. An attractive woman, naked, makeup, hair done, jewelry, kind of laying back on a white background like that. She looks like a centerfold in something like Playboy or Maxim or so on. So what does this mean? And what might it mean? Okay, that's what I should say. What might it mean? Okay, what it might mean is that while the ad explicitly tells us not to eat meat, it also implicitly tells us that pornography treats women as objects for our consumption. The advertisement therefore draws our attention to women's rights as well as animal rights. As I said, this is just one possible interpretation from just a few details in it. There's a lot more that one could say about it. I just wanted to give you an idea of how to do the homework. So, now it's your turn. Go to our shared folder on the Google Drive and look at the Halo Oral Antiseptic advertisement. It's called Lisa's Sneeze. Open the document, advertise analysis, group exercise, and follow directions, add your own observations. Good luck.